In order to render anything, we need to think in terms of value to create form. In our previous video, we introduced the earth tones. The earth tones represent a value range in color and help unify any color we add to them in our piece. Now that we've had a chance to paint with them, hopefully you noticed how each tone has a certain color trait when added to white or black. As seen in the chart, the scale also reflects a color wheel in terms of warm and cool. In today's video, we are introducing a few new colors to expand and add depth to our palette. The color on the left is Cadmium Red Light, which we've been using. When I compare it to our new color, Naphthol Crimson, on the right, there is a noticeable difference. In order to compare one color to another, we want to first ask ourselves which color is warmer and which is cooler. This alleviates confusion based on hue. Next, we will ask how much that color leans towards any other colors in that particular temperature range. Here, Naphthol Crimson is cooler than Cadmium Red Light because it has some blue qualities. So that means Cadmium Red Light is warmer and has yellow or orange qualities. This is the color palette we'll be using. Ultramarine blue is also being added to add depth to our grays and shadow color. By itself in this palette, ultramarine blue can be used either warm or cool depending on how you mix it. This is my palette setup. I'm using a reusable enamel tray to mix my paint on. I place my colors on a wet paper towel inside the tray to keep them wet longer. When I'm done, I'll cover my tray with saran wrap to prevent it from drying. When I start my gesture drawing, I use burnt sienna and look for an interplay of shapes created by the pose of the figure. Major axis lines, like the tilt of the head, the clavicle bone below the neck, the bottom of the rib cage, the direction of the hips, legs, arms, and feet, can visually be extended as lines across your picture plane and create a shape as soon as it hits another axis line. Sometimes these will create shapes in the negative spaces, like in the area between the left arm and the rib cage, or the triangle between the legs. These shapes will help you place the figure on your page. I also use a combination of transparent and opaque paint with water to capture a sense of weight and shadow so that the drawing is closer to how I remember when I first saw it. Next, I apply a light wash of burnt sienna again over the top so that the white of the surface is knocked back and all other colors that I add on top will be unified. You can use any earth tone for this and achieve different tones, but since burnt sienna is the mid-tone, it can be easily shifted lighter or darker. You can also mix one dominant color to this initial wash if you know you want your piece to have an overall color key. Now I'm blocking in my darkest shadow shapes with raw umber because it's the coolest earth tone with a slightly bluish quality. Remember to use a flat brush so that you cover more surface area and follow the planes of the body because the angle of your shapes will be more correct. Keep looking back and forth between the model in front of you and your paper so that you draw what's really in front of you. Light your model in a way that creates distinct shapes of light and shadow, and it will be easier to paint. Depending on your reference, you may need to accentuate some shadows in order to sculpt the figure from the background. Next, I'll block in my brightest highlight shapes. Here I'm using Cadmium Red Light, yellow ochre, and white to begin. I start at the top where the figure catches the most direct warm light and work my way down. I notice that the highlight color on my reference starts to shift a cooler red as it leads down. So, as I work on those areas, I add a little Naphthol Crimson to my mixture to tint it slightly cooler because it has some blue in it, yet is still warm. If I need to tint it even cooler, I'll reach for Ultramarine blue and add to the mixture. Now I block in other shadow shapes with burnt umber. These are areas next to and coming out of the darkest raw umber shadows. They begin to warm up because they are receiving some light. They are not quite dark, but also not that bright. At this point, your figure should have a fairly even amount of value distribution and basic planar structure, because the midtone fills in a lot of work between your highlights and shadows. Don't worry if the shapes feel like they are getting bigger than what they really appear. You want to look objectively at the reference for value and temperature to render for you in the beginning. In order to break up these shapes, you'll want to cross the planes you've already established from a slightly different direction with other color mixtures as you continue to paint. At this point, I like to block in my background so that I can see how my values and color on the figure are relating. I'm starting with white here and then adjusting accordingly. You can get opaque with the white in areas next to the edge of the figure where you want to draw more contrast to and round out the form. I'll get transparent with white in other areas that can just rest back. I now add raw sienna in the shapes that are coming out of the highlights and into the midtone. Next, I'm using a combination of cadmium red light, burnt umber, and burnt sienna to adjust my initial midtone wash. Now I'm using a combination of raw or burnt umber, white, and ultramarine blue to glaze and tone some of the areas that I want in cooler shadow. Glazing is a term that means to apply a semi-thin layer of paint over another surface so that you still see the layer underneath. Everyone has their own proficiencies with this, so you may tend to get opaque if you need to. Now that I'm happy with my value distribution, I'm going to concentrate on pushing my color in the highlights and shadows and refine until finish. I'm adding cadmium red light in areas receiving the most direct highlight from the source, Naphthol crimson in cooler highlights just outside the light source, and ultramarine blue in my deepest shadows. Remember that by adding even the slightest indication of color into a shadow, it will deepen and enrich that shadow by showing more form. The illustrator N.C. Wyeth was a master at this. You can also add red to the edge of a shape where there's high contrast between light and dark, and it will do the same thing. Your eye will visually mix it for you. Remember that to create a likeness, you want an arrangement of shapes with hard and soft edges, because light will cast over the form differently depending on contrast of light and shadow from the planes and mass of the body. If you zoom in close, you'll see I added pure ultramarine blue in the shadows between the toes and floor, and Naphthol crimson as a highlight on the thigh and raised wrist. In this other example, I'll follow the same steps as before to demonstrate how to tint my earth tones, cooler and warmer, with ultramarine blue and Naphthol crimson, but I'll work on a figure with a lighter skin tone. I'll block in my darkest shadow shapes with raw umber to begin. Next, I'll apply burnt umber to the shapes that are creeping out of the shadow and slightly into light. Next, I'll block in my brightest highlight shapes with a combination of cadmium red light, yellow ochre, and white. Next, I'll block in my background to tie the figure to the environment. Notice how similar the background color is to the figure. It's basically warm and cool colors that can be found on the figure. I'm adjusting my highlight shapes because the initial paint dried differently than I expected. I'm also tinting some of the highlight shapes from about the waist down with Naphthol crimson because they appear to be cooler in my reference. Now I'm blocking in some cooler tones in my shadows with ultramarine blue, raw umber, and white. I'm now adding raw sienna between areas of my highlight and midtone to create an easy transition. Now I will refine to finish, pushing my warms and cools. Remember to mix your earth tones first, then tint with color, like red or blue. Depending on your style, you may decide to play up the color in your pieces, which is fine, but know that subtlety lies in the muted gray earth tones first. Then we draw attention to something with color.